Thank you for coming to this concluding key event of our Diasporas program here at Sprechsaal. I also want to thank Lior and myself for inviting myself to deliver this last one, just because we share a bed with our dog. I'm going to be trying a lot of Oscar award type jokes tonight, so be advised. And of course also a thank you to Lars of Sprechsaal and all the participating artists and speakers in our program. There might be more events listed later online on the website of Sprechsaal. Do check. The whole show itself will run until 14th of this month. And I also want to thank Yaniv, who is in charge of these moving things here. So, yeah, and he's actually here, Yaniv Topiol. So, yeah, he actually won me an award. The motherfucker. Yeah. In addition, several graphic novels relating to the show are on display at the table in the foyer. And just outside are my own 2 graphic novels which relate directly to this talk's theme and are also available for purchase. Please go have a look later. Thank you. So, up until now in the program, I took part as audience to some pretty darn interesting talks and debates on the formation of diasporic, local, national, and ethnic entities, mainly within the framework of Jewish, Israeli, German entities, with also some broader insight on corresponding Palestinian identity and Eurocentric philosophy vis-a-vis recent developments in the Middle East, for example, namely ISIS. In other words, from past to the present. So as a change, to conclude, I will be delivering a futuristic science fiction artist talk. But I will try to be as structured in my argumentation as possible based on actual academic precedent, because truthfully, what usually happens in my artwork is that my stories end up being mini essays, and my essays are at times rejected for being slightly outlandish stories. I am working on that starting from today. So what will now happen is that I will briefly lay out the key notes I found interesting in conjunction with both my work and the show's theme, until Jay, one of my main collaborators on this work, can eventually join us to present the project. Later, I hope the film will provoke some questions and thoughts about the points, which would be listed on the screen, and I will make believe as if I'm attempting to answer your questions when actually I'll be trying systematically to read from my tablet. This is going to be a creative exercise on the biblical concept of Hakol Yadua Merosh V'Harashut Netuna, or in my loose imposing translation, everything is predetermined under pretense of free will. Altogether, it will take 1 hour. Okay? Okay, let's begin. So, in the title of the event, The Future Nativity of the Digital Self, I highlighted 2 words, nativity and digital, and this obviously refers to the concept of the digital native, and maybe implies that in my talk I am going to wonder about the future of this person, which is a digital native, and that I would probably want to question just how digital, just how native, and maybe even just how much of a self this person is going to continue and be. So, just to get a small obstacle out of the way, in case someone here doesn't know what a digital native is, at least according to Google, it is, and I quote, a person born or brought up during the age of digital technology, and so familiar with computers and the internet from an early age, end quote. To paraphrase Wikipedia's paraphrasing of a guy called Mark, these are native speakers of the digital language of computers. And here's another of Wikipedia's paraphrasing of another guy called Josh. Those are, according to him, those are people who were born digital. End paraphrased quote of paraphrased quote. But I'll take a cautious leap of thought, which a lot of scholars in media studies have long since taken, and I'll assume in this talk that digitization, digital cultures, and digital media extend far beyond what one might normally consider digital, like wristwatches, remote controls, cell phones, smartphones, etc. And I will assume that this thing called the digital was actually always omnipresent as part of our environment, and maybe today it is even more omnipresent because etymologically, digital essentially means not just what is computed, that is numbers, which are digits, but what can be touched, picked apart with the digits of our hands, our fingers. So in this sense, a lot of our environment was always digital, that is tangible. And now, more than before, a lot of newer media, which from the 20s and up until the late 90s was untouchable, was only virtual projection. We could only perceive, by that I mean film, television, but also printed advertising you could only read and look at. This newer media is now also more and more digital in the older sense of the word because it conveys to a certain extent that it could be affected by touch. It's clickable, you can comment on it inline, easily share it after you've altered it using your fingertips on your smartphone, etc. So I would not claim that what is happening now is that things are becoming more digital, because all media from its offset was first and foremost digital. Now, writing, painting, sculpting, even walking and driving, whatever means one uses to transport information, we have digits on our feet too. Instead, I claim that simulatory screened media of the 20th century is now also being made tangible, to the point we can no longer distinguish between simulation and non-simulation, between these amorphous notions one might still cling to of the ungraspable virtual and the very graspable real. Obviously, this is a complete distortion of the concept. You can't grasp that which is real unless you define it through language, and language is an imaginary construct. It is the DNA, if you will, the essence of the virtual. So you can only grasp that which is virtual, but now, through our new technologies, we can not only grasp what is virtual in our mind, but also with our fingers. So this should obviously be nothing too new to anyone who got to read a bit of Baudrillard. What I'm talking about is merely an extension of his ideas into the smart age. The emerging phase of neo-digitization is what we also call augmentation, and this is why I labeled my project, as you see on the screen, an augmented graphic novel. So, in a sense, the digital native is this being for whom the borders between the tangible and non-tangible, between language and matter, have completely collapsed, or better yet, imploded one into another. Yes? Okay. So now we can proceed to the main thematic framework of the talk. I framed its premise as a number of successive questions. So, is world peace possible? Is an identity in such a world a sustainable concept if this identity is devoid of any geographic borders to which this identity could relate to? That is, in terms of a culture or ethnic locus, as well as in terms of basic citizenship, privileges, and rights. And if so, would such a world peace state really be utopia? Here are the key points. 1, I would first claim that multicultural identities are already, in fact, post-national non-identities. And the origins of these identities, their original ethnic, indigenous, cultural identity, which was forged throughout history, has been replaced by a neoliberal, consumerist mindset, which renders all cultural attributes into superficial, virtual information, which today is quite clear is also a form of online projection. In other words, your identity is a piece of intellectual property which this or that financial entity owns and trades according to their interest. Second point, the main carriers of this westernizing, cultural, uprooting trend, or if one would be blunt, this ethnic cleansing, are none other than kids worldwide who try to oppose ethnic culture with counter-cultures which are none other than capitalist, consumerist lifestyles. 3, because multicultural post-national identities don't really exist, again, they are non-identities, they need the other, distant, seemingly authentic cultures to define themselves as their opposite. So it's one big, homogeneous, superior opposite to all other genuine cultures. 4, even if ideally capitalist multiculturalism renders all planetary cultures into one, so it completely disarms them into empty monoculture under some kind of corporate one-world government, even still, new opposite cultural identities are bound to emerge. And they will emerge from none other than the very same kids who originally helped peddle the monoculture, which eventually took over. Why? Because they're bored. 5, fundamental. True boredom is possibly the strongest revolutionary propellant known to human civilization. 6, the more homogeneous and standardizing the mainstream is, the more radical and fundamental the attempt to form new identities becomes, what many times bears this form of what we sometimes call terrorism. And the last point, even still, these new identities too are also depleted, phantasmatic, non-identities, just on the more extreme edge of the scale. Because in a backwards logic, they too are essentially only simulations of radicalism. They're mere imitations and hollow reproductions of fundamentalism. Because these radical actions are being carried out by the same digital natives, all children of the West to an extent, for whom any identity attribute is, again, superficial, virtual information, a virtual product which signifies absolutely nothing except for being radical to the mainstream. In other words, in the post-digital neoliberal world, everything, even the most extreme identity show-off, is as flat and as shallow as a viral internet meme. No form of cultural information has any real value except for the amount of instantaneous attention it gets, which is measured by the number of clicks and shares. So this is pretty much so this is right on cue. This is Jay. She's just joined us. I'll just see that it is working. Jay, can you hear us?
Yep.
Okay, this is your cue. Go.
Okay, hi. My name is Jordan, but online I'm Jay. So just Jay. And I'm from the future or tomorrow, like 2000 and, you know. So what I'm showing you guys here is an app, and it looks like a weird chromosome thing made out of cells, which are actually sleeping. And it's all basically a story made of lots of itty-bitty stories, like particles of text and pictures, about me and my friends. So this is us, or like me and my friends, looking hella bored. And we all live in these houses in suburbs, somewhere in the world, and there's no wars because everyone is totally okay with things. Everyone understands everybody else. That's because everyone speaks English, like, only. And all the rest of the poor people in the world are now dead, because there's no more ecosystem, I think. Or those guys just don't matter anymore because everything is made with robots. So technology is all wow. Everything is like virtual and 3D and moving and you can touch it and it does 3D stuff, you know? Augmented reality stuff. Anyways, you can move through this app and that way you also learn how we do stuff nowadays or like how we think. But not actually think because thinking is also boring for us. So we actually don't think, we link. In other words, this app is basically a bunch of interconnected info about us, and each time you finish one bit, you choose which next bit to link it to, whichever way you want, and then it becomes all less boring. Like a story. Basically everything we do goes online eventually. Like in this story, we take a cutie kitty cat and we kill it. We tie it to the rails, and then when a train comes, it makes this precious boy little face, so then we take a picture of it and we post it. Aww.
Jay, can I interrupt?
Yep.
Okay. You're doing this again. You're not mentioning the backbone of the story.
The back what?
The backbone, the life story of Bernard Bougebra.
Oh, right,
you know, the guy who writes about you and presents.
Right, yeah.
So could you just... Thank you.
Anyway, so yeah, each cell you activate in this app, you learn more about us, and there's also some heavy philosophy stuff by this depressing dead Algerian French guy you can read if you're really philosophical. Like here, he's all like, the problem we're still facing is primarily that of interface. We like and like everything until everyone and everything is all alike, though liking has nothing to do with it. And blah, blah, blah. You get it. It sucks. Probably old people will find it fascinating. But like, if you keep playing and connecting to the right stuff, it leads you to loads of cool features. And you eventually discover what we're doing. For instance, the other day I'm totally bored, right? So I fuck my brother, and then I make him kill himself, and then I cut myself in the shower, which was sad, but like in a beautiful way. Or another time I go and gun down all my classmates, and they all act scared and stuff. Or sometimes you can detonate yourself in a crowded bus or department store and be all like, fuck the system. Anyways, you can always go back to the chromosome, and it shows you how far along you are in the story, because your goal is basically to reach the end of each of the main parts, which are these clusters, right? They're basically like levels you need to pass to get to the next one. Like here, I almost made it to the end of the first cluster, and now it's getting all radiant and tweaked up. But I'm just gonna fast forward here. So this is a really progressive stage, and the entire top is already rotting and cancery. But never mind that now, because the more you read, you find there's even weirder stuff happening. Like in New York, there's this water coming from the ground, and nobody knows where it's coming from, and it's like growing, and everybody's getting super worried, even the president. And this scientist guy now finds out that water actually has a rhythm, and it's weird because it's exactly the same rhythm me and my friends all dance to. It's sort of this tribal thing. And we're the only ones hearing it. We hear it in our headphones while we share and kill stuff, and we also hear it rising from the ground each time we bend over the toilet to barf last night's dinner. So basically, we're probably the ones causing it. And if you really make it to the very end, you can actually hear it.
Jay, is this gonna be longer? Because I really want to, people are kind of like waiting and...
Wait for it.
Okay.
Wait for it.
Jay, what the hell are you doing in there? Jay.
None of your business.
Jay.
What?
Mom's calling you for dinner and I really need to go.
Give me a minute. Anyways, yeah, it's this cool new kind of metal sound. So yeah, we're the new shit in this boring world. And we finally come of age. And now we're set to destroy it. And it's fun too. Turns out when you break it all down, it really breaks down. So, thanks again for setting this up, guys. And welcome to this final stage of enhancement. Okay, bye. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Kids. So yeah, I hope you could take something from this. Right. So, a friend of mine asked me the other day, to paraphrase, how can you say there is no national identity today? If anything, there is no... Wait. Make more sense? No. As much as I enjoy watching my silhouette covering everything. So she was asking me, how can you say that there is no national identity today? If anything, there is a rise in nationalism. So I assume she meant things such as the Islamic State, and in a sense, its reactionary German Pegida, the conflict between Russia and the Ukraine, the disengagement of Greece from EU policy, and who could forget, of course, the Israeli apartheid. So my answer would be that, of course, there is a rise of groups who are trying to reclaim or even reinvent notions of autonomous or enclaved nationality, of national imperialism, jihad, and whatnot. But these national identities are also just a facade, a sort of a simulation, because throughout the late 19th century and 20th century, all the attempts... Oh, come on. Shut up. Where were we? So, throughout the 19th century and 20th century, all the attempts to institutionalize nationalism through democracy, fascism, communism, etc., they have all failed. And so underneath the national facade on a culturally endemic level, the entire construct currently operates pretty much as one homogeneous international mechanism, which we call multiculturalism, which is, in effect, its very opposite, neocapitalist monoculturalism. So my film only speculates on what will become of this in the near future. And assuming we're not extinct, though judging from the current state of things, my story is really science fiction because it assumes some of us will still be here. I would like to base this argument on Zizek's assertions on multiculturalism from 1998 or so. I originally was introduced to these ideas during my current studies in a text called A Plea for Intolerance. I decided to use Zizek for this one because, like my mother always says, everyone gets his chance to completely misunderstand Nietzsche and at everyone else's expense, but at least so far, when you fuck up Zizek's argument, it doesn't end with the Holocaust. So, using this argument...
The night is young.
Yeah. Using his argument, I would like to suggest that we are in fact already in such a state of global relative peace, or at least converging towards such a state. It is peace in the sense of rest, but it has taken the form of a volatile stasis, so to speak. It's less like matter, more like gas. Our world is seemingly forever changing, constantly destabilizing, but right at the same time it remains also constantly and completely intact as an intellectual entity, because the very strategy of the system which runs the world, what we end up calling capitalism, even though I haven't yet come across a single person, perhaps even Marx, including Zizek, who can exactly make out what capitalism actually is and how it is different from other regulatory financial systems. Maybe Zizek is the only one to tacitly admit it, if I understand his argument correctly, that capitalism thrives on its inability to be defined, and it forever cloaks itself as its opposite. So to achieve this invisibility, it implements multiculturalism. The very strategy of late capitalism dwells on uprooting and eradicating any fundamental cultural differences which disturb the financial mechanism. Instead, it replaces them with a hollow shell of superficial cultural attributes which are tolerated so long as they fall in line with the imposed order of things. But this order as well is not a Euro-Americo-centric order. It is not German culture or an American culture which maintains its supremacy, because these cultures too have been what Zizek calls auto-self-colonized by the businesses which run them, which run through them. In effect, all cultures are made into a rootless, empty, monocultural shell. So basically, there is no more authentic culture in our so-called Western or Westernized or Westernizing world. There isn't even a true direction. The very concept of East and West is a false geographic imposition, because all directions of the wind have been rendered at the same in a compass which spins whimsically and can now only serve as an ornament. Or in other more poetic words, or his poetic words, I will quote Zizek, and tonight is Purim, the Jewish costume holiday, so I'm allowing myself to get into character, and I quote, "This very reference to a particular formula is a screen for the universal anonymity of capital. The horror is not the particular living ghost in the dead universal machine, but the dead universal machine in the very heart of each particular living ghost." End quote. You see his point, I hope. More Zizek later. Second point. So here is another quote from a book with a very trashy title, Jihad versus Mech World. It was written by one Benjamin Barber, and I liked it very much when I came across it, especially because, unlike its title may suggest, it was written before 9/11, in the mid-90s during Clinton's administration, which some of us might choose to remember as a more peaceful time. So I'll start by quoting a short segment, or actually kind of long segment, here from a chapter called China and the Pacific Rim. Now, Benjamin Barber is an American scholar, so imagine I am also imitating him when I do an American accent. Here's what he says about Japanese youth. "The carriers of corruption are finally neither outsiders nor barbarians, but Japan's own youth, who, even as the indigenous cultures work to socialize them as native Japanese, have proved themselves adept apprentices of the global practices of mech world." Mech world is synonymous in Barber's case to corporate capitalism, I guess. End quote. He then continues and writes about youth more generally, and I quote, "They shake their local folk zithers at a centralist and encroaching French or German or Japanese culture they despise, and then hammer out the tunes of an even more centralist and encroaching global culture on their quaint instruments." End quote. And he even concludes, especially for my film, though again I found this book only some years after I started working on this, he says, that these kids are dragged reluctantly from a past defined by culture and tribe into a future where velocity is becoming an identity all in its own. End quote. This is in the 90s, and he concludes, "The outcome inside their struggling souls will likely condition the outcome for global civilization, whose prospects consequently do not seem terribly promising. End quote. That is to say, teenagers and young adults appropriate the attributes of what they perceive as conformist or non-conformist or so-called Western countercultures like punk, like hip-hop, metal, but also promiscuous pop acts like Justin Bieber, Rihanna, and of course Miley Cyrus, who might actually be the most radical badass punk of them all. Adolescents take on these sub-countercultural roles in order to oppose the mainstream in their land, the so-called Leitkultur, leading culture in German, when in fact they are tacitly and peacefully streaming in an immense globalizing current. These kids, and presumably their kids and the ones to come after them, no longer belong to the local culture, but rather to one huge international multi-Leitkultur, which has already embedded, demarcated, trademarked, and disarmed its very own set of oppositional countercultures and has rendered them into nothing more than a lifestyle. And a great example of this is what happened with metal music from the 90s up until this point. Metal originally splintered off of middle-class rock and roll and punk youth movements in the late 70s in the UK and in the USA. It was actually a sort of watered-down form of youth rebellion after punk, because even though it dealt with death and war, it did it from a very aesthetic fascination. It basically depoliticized punk and confined any scary, violent, critical practice to the concert halls. Outside, you could make out a headbanger or a metalist with a very nice black t-shirt print and maybe some long hair, which by then was very much accepted. But in the 90s, influenced by various factions and further musical splits within the metal scene, among other socio-political developments in Northern Europe, metal actually culminated in Norway in the very violent subculture of black metal. This movement had an actual political agenda, which they called Satanism. But if you dig into it a bit, you learn that they did have a rather framed argument. Not just killing cats and worshipping Satan. Satan was a counter, amorphous symbol to the Judo-Christo mainstream. So these guys had a worldview that incorporated a mix of racial supremacy and hate to monotheism in general, starting from Judaism, but mostly Christianity, which they hated for colonizing Norway and erasing the Norse paganism. And to enforce this, these guys really were physically violent against themselves. They commit suicide, and their bandmates photographed their corpses and put it on the next album cover. They killed competing band members over various arguments. But they were also physically violent towards others. They killed gays, kidnapped and tortured people. They spread out ghost heads on stage while in their performances. And most notoriously, they burnt a lot of churches. Some were very antique churches. So in a sense, this sensation was not so far off from ISIS today, with the beheadings and destroying archaeological monuments and artifacts, etc. The way the westernizing mainstream dealt with black metal was quite remarkable. First, since this was a phenomenon led by white native Norwegians, they simply characterized these perpetrators as a bunch of kids who took things too far. Just like West Germany preferred to think of the RAF, Baader-Meinhof, which is exemplary in the way that Al-Adé's documentary about the RAF was titled Der Krieg der Bürgerkinder, loosely translated as, I think, the War of the Citizen or City Kids. So, mind you, the RAF had an extremely compelling ideology, much better founded than black metal, and Ulrika Meinhof, Andreas Baader, and others of the RAF were in about their 30s, not exactly kids, whereas ISIS and Hamas, and to be clear and fair, also armies such as the Israeli Defense Force, they employ 18-year-olds or younger, but we never disclaim them as just a bunch of kids acting out. In principle, I think that this was a very racist distinction, because they probably thought, oh, these are blonde, fair-skinned kids with a dull face smiling to the camera in court after they were caught. So no, this can't seriously be a radical other. This has to be just a kid in a costume. So they simply neutralized the argument of black metal, turned it into a scary joke, but nevertheless a joke. The second thing they did is they used the fact that black metal itself was a part of the watered-down, commodified, commercialized global movement of metal. Black metalists printed CDs, they had t-shirts, merch, etc. So what happened was that the mainstream helped black metal become even more commercialized. Black metal bands like Cradle of Filth, for instance. MTV hosted it in ghetto spots, etc. until it once again went back to being a lifestyle and lost all its sting. Not the singer Sting. Just like what happened with the Che Guevara t-shirts, for instance. So the mainstream strategy went so far to the point that in 2011, black metal was also taught as part of the educational program of Norwegian diplomats on account of its value as a touristic attraction. So they reappropriated a hostile bunch of Christian monument incinerators into a touristic attraction. And today, you have things like baby metal. Have you seen this Japanese phenomenon? I put the picture earlier here. Right? So basically it boils down to, I think, a bunch of barely teenage girls in sinister costumes who perform choreographed death metal songs on stage. You have another picture of them here. It's a Katy Perry-style mega concert production. Obviously, for many Americans and Europeans, the exotic cultural fusion really is fascinating, and it merges concepts of Japanese kawaii and idol pop with exceptionally refined metal songwriting. But you could argue that baby metal was originally an excuse to dress up little girls as lolitas in BDSM Victorian corsets to feed concealed pedophile tendencies of Japanese men. It's like a soft-core version of hentai porno manga. This I claim when I consider the fact that their top hit, Give Me Chocolate, is about a girl who needs to fight the urge to eat sweets because she must watch her weight. And considering the fact that in Japan at least, the majority of the audience was registered as males. To quote Fuse Magazine's review of a show in Tokyo, the show is roughly 70 to 80% guys who love pop music, i.e. cute girl groups, end quote. So I think that Japan's baby metal shows that beyond a shadow of a doubt, metal and punk, which started off as proletarian counter-culture cultures, so long since they have been rendered into yet another more appealing, yet all the more neutralizing vessel of what Deleuze describes as a society of control based on self-control. It's always sexier to refer to Deleuze instead of Foucault. So similar to what we see in the film, these kids operate like a Trojan horse, covered with glitter or cool graffiti or patches with anti-capitalist band slogans or whatever. But this Trojan horse never exactly attacks the neighbor kingdom. Instead, it rolls its way into the heart of the town square, opens shop, and sells ice cream in various colors but pretty much identical taste to all the kids in the kingdom until none of them want to eat their parents' food. And then they gorge on ice cream until they regurgitate and puke on everything to the point that you can't tell one kingdom apart from another because everything is now covered with a lot of disgusting pink ice cream. Third point. Back to Zizek. So, Later on in this set of arguments he shows that currently the multiculturalist needs the other culture, against which the multiculturalist demonstrates a superiority in order to maintain a sense of self-identity. It's as if the multiculturalist is saying, I am completely vacated and therefore devoid of self-definition. So I must define myself as the opposite of you. So I'm paraphrasing the concept here, but as I understand it, according to Zizek's definition of the multicultural code, the multiculturalist says to his fellow immigrant or to any person of any other culture, by me agreeing to acknowledge and tolerate you, your questionably hygienic customs, your outdated, senseless religious beliefs, dubious moral codes, etc. By doing that, I, at one and the same time, define myself as the opposite of you and as better than you, because tolerating you makes me a more benevolent, noble, enlightened person. And when you agree to tolerate my culture, which actually doesn't exist except for being the negative of yours, you are basically playing to my rules. You are enacting tolerance, which is my supreme value. And so you are submitting to the rule of my multicultural system of beliefs and therefore accepting that my empty multicultural position is superior to yours. In other words, multiculturalism is a form of tacit, distanced racism, of this kind of cyborg race of people with no true cultural identity or practice except for this identity hierarchy politics. And what's more, when the other appears even more radical, when this other perpetuates violence, when this other is beyond tolerating, we become even more tolerant towards everyone else in our spectrum. We become all the more inclusive. We become all the more mono. Political discrepancies aside, we all become Charlie. But number 4, let's leave this we and talk for a moment about, let's go back to the points just so you know what I'm talking about, right? Because this is proving demanding. So let's leave this we and talk for a moment about this radical other and just how radical this other in theory is. So 4 is a mini point. In the film, I try to imagine a situation in which the machine has self-colonized all its colonies, eradicated its centers, and monoculturalized its citizens so comprehensively that the very concept of otherness is no longer graspable. So, would this be the end of all form of more or less radical opposition? I argue that no, an other will always emerge. But in the film, this other emerges within. It is the consumerist adolescents which wake up and take an aggressive stance against the monocultural hegemony. The reason? They're bored. Is that really so hard to imagine? So point 5. Consider the UK riots of 2011 and the various reasons given to them. I think it was 2011? I think so. Should have checked that. I'm pretty sure it is. Basically, for 4 days, all hell broke loose in the UK. It started off as political protest against an arrest which led to murder by the police, but it escalated beyond containment to the point that, though predominantly teens, everyone who was anyone from any social class went out looting shops and rampaging in the streets. I followed the reports in real time enthusiastically because it felt to touch very close to my work. And I found that lots of reporters tried to conceal their confusion behind very strong words, but what amazed me was that no one could come up with a comprehensive, settling explanation to what was taking place. The left blamed austerity. The right canceled the argument, saying basically it was a mimetic infestation of criminal incentive which spread in the British youth beehive. In other words, it was an enormous bunch of kids abusing the weak arm of the law simply because they're bored. But I sincerely believe that both of these arguments are completely true. They hinge on one another. True, genuine boredom caused by the ruling system is the imperative of a true revolutionary moment. Boredom in class is a result of educational oppression. Stagnation in the market, in social mobility, and is the result of oppression, is what leads to social unrest. So in that sense, every attempt for revolution, every intifada starts from genuine, true boredom. Perhaps this is why, in what at first sounds like a completely outlandish argument, I always felt that Palestinian and various Israeli youths are not too far apart. Now, I'm not saying that they're the same in terms of their living conditions, not at all. In the last air raid on Gaza, most Israeli youths were practically untouchable, while Palestinian kids had half their family members and friends wiped out in front of their eyes, and some were just killed for playing on the beach. But I'm just suggesting that by replacing the primarily right-wing claim of perpetuated, increasing, broiling hate passed on from generation to generation, if I replace this with the claim of growing unbearable boredom, we could maybe say that the Palestinians throw rocks at checkpoints because they are deprived of education and work, because they have no control of their land. Whereas the Israelis, for instance, 16-year-old punk rockers who complain about not having anything to do at night, they go trash their suburb and render it a temporary autonomous zone block party. Both youths are actually suffering from the same results generated by militaristic apartheid. All main resources are invested elsewhere, and so they are deprived of recreational activity. They're bored. A situation like the Israeli occupation, which doesn't change, even as it escalates, becomes boring. And the fact that more and more people are killed in less and less time, though the situation remains a stasis, makes the situation unbearably frustrating and truly boring. And so the more unbearably boring the situation, the more radical and violent the response against this boredom. And this is exactly how government contains these crises. Bored people don't stay bored for long. They might protest. They might rebel. Hell, it might even work. So what to do? Make people busy again in a manner that generates zero results. Get the protesting Israelis to run around from job to job trying to make ends meet. Get Palestinians to resort to pointless, harmless aggression, throwing sterile missiles which can't hit a single thing. What do these people have to lose? From what point is a boring life better than a serious boost of adrenaline right before you die? My last 2 points will conclude and bring us back around to the concept of what I mean by digital non-identity today. So for point 6, I would first like to quote verbatim a vlog entry by one Brooklyn-born person of color called Philco out of his vlog channel, Philco versus the World. And he talks regarding the 3 teenage girls that traveled to join ISIS from Denver, Colorado in 2014. And he says, and I quote, no impersonation, but nevertheless, verbatim, all the black niggers out there, let me tell y'all all something. We ain't shit no more. Remember back in the days when like young teens wanted to rebel against their parents, whether black or white, what did they do? They used to date the most ghetto black nigger they could find. Remember that? To really get back at their parents, to show them and teach them a lesson, especially the white girls when their parents were racist. No, but, oh, really, that's how you feel? Then they go and find the most ghetto black guy they could find. We've been replaced. They're gonna go join ISIS. We've been replaced. Them ISIS niggers are hard. End quote. One reacts to monoculturalism with an urge to forge a stark contesting identity, to self-define oneself and to form a new visible form of antagonistic agency and to shove it in the face of authority. Again, like in many cases of anti-colonial resistance, Like Barber shows throughout his book, standardization and radicalism fuel one another. This is as true about ISIS chopping heads off for YouTube, and I have a feeling it is even more true about European and American youths and young adults who saw these videos and decided to go join ISIS, just as it was true in the late 70s British class wars when Sex Pistols' Sid Vicious, he went around with a huge red swastika printed on his t-shirt. Both ISIS followers and punks try to beat the hegemony at its own game. They essentially do exactly what multiculturalism does when it defines itself as the hollow supreme negative of all other cultures. They are depicted as this proverbial other, which monoculturalism needs so much, but now this other answers back to the monocultural bulldozer by becoming so radical, attempting to become the very epitome of radical otherness to the point it can no longer be tolerated by the hegemony. It regains its identity by seriously pissing people off. By the way, reclaiming the pejorative term nigger plays on the very same concept. So based on this idea, Western ISIS teens, punks, black, and death metal fans today, even neo-Nazis, are all capitalist productions. Hollow, fringe identity brands which only reflect the negative of their other, hollow mainstream brand. But again, to remind you, we're living in increasingly virtually digitized times where matter and language, organ and hologram collapse into each other. And so in the film, I accelerated this concept, and my kids have no longer any sort of appreciation for their bodies. They live solely within the framework of the virtual. So the fundamental act of otherness doesn't represent them as much as they simply become it. They become the otherness, which in itself is just a simulation of otherness, which, just like any creation of multicultural neocapitalism, is uprooted and devoid of any meaning except for being aesthetically stimulating to these kids. Again, this is traced most conspicuously to Baudrillard, and Baudrillard himself constantly referred to Walter Benjamin, so I just have to quote Benjamin's comment on what happens when radical forces, in his case 1930s fascism, completely aestheticize political military action to a point that it is perceived as a work of art, which replicates and glorifies life until life itself becomes a simulation though the living are no longer capable of realizing the value of their own lives aside for serving a part of a simulation. And I quote, "Mankind's self-alienation has reached such a degree that it can experience its own destruction as an aesthetic pleasure of the first order." End motherfucking quote. This divine fascination with yourself as a simulation, while forgetting you have a mortal body, is similar to people who fly their amateur drones, and they become so absorbed in it, looking through the installed camera of the drone, they become the drone, seeing through its eyes, that they become so absorbed that they don't notice in which direction they're flying and then accidentally smash into themselves. So now, that was the end of this point, and now really this is my absolutely final point. So thank you for tolerating, as our culture always recommends. I would like to question just how different, how authentic, how non-simulatory the original ISIS fighters are compared to their supposedly confused Western aficionados. A credible identity is an imaginary construct which can convince its audience that it has been forged through time, through a historical process. Fundamentalist violence tries to create an instant, credible identity by physically affecting history, creating a sensational event that goes down in history or simply forces history to change, like 9/11. So this change will register this identity as real, as true. But then I guess I claim, according to this argument, that today and in the coming future, radical groups, for instance, a group like ISIS, can't really win against capitalism on the long run. This is probably true also about any other industrial age-based form of religious ideology, be it fascism, National Socialism, but unfortunately also democracy and communism. Because the old digital world they so desperately long to affect, to register a change in, to cling to and go back to, the pure world where there was a binary distinction between the purely virtual or spiritual and the purely tangible, physical or secular, this world no longer exists. If it ever did, again, basically we always lived in simulation because, like I said, language is in itself both a virtual digital construct and was always the prerequisite to any human civilization, but never mind. So now ISIS really tried to acknowledge this discrepancy by trying to digitally, that is physically, alter history with sledgehammers. Now I'm referring to the latest video they uploaded where they smashed to bits ancient Assyrian and Akkadian artifacts in a museum in Iraq. Have you seen this? So this is quite absurd, just as it is remarkable. Of course, this isn't just a singular event attributed to contemporary fundamentalists or to radical Islam. On the contrary, smashing the monuments of your rival religion is a pretty common revolutionary practice carried out time and again throughout history. But still, the fact that they publicized this via social media and the recent uproar this created, for some of us, it was much more disturbing than the beheadings. This is what I find fascinating in context of identity and simulation today. I guess what I find so interesting here is the way we react to attempts of what Zizek calls true violence and our definition of it. And now I'm really reaching my close. So basically, if I get Zizek's argument correctly, this is how he puts it more or less. Gandhi's peaceful protest was eventually 10 times more violent than Hitler or Stalin's actions, or maybe just as violent, since he introduced lasting systemic change. He fundamentally disrupted what was earlier perceived as the natural order of things. Whereas Hitler and Stalin killed millions out of cowardness, exactly because they felt powerless to truly motivate inherent change in the minds of people, and exactly because they felt they were on borrowed time on a broader historical timeline. They physically tried to enforce their version of change and to prevent impending change by shutting up the opposition. So I find it fitting, yet strange, that this is exactly why ISIS's recent statue-smashing sledgehammer gymnastics stung me so much harder than their previous viral campaigns. Something in me recognized that ISIS have somehow understood Zizek's concept of true violence, viscerally. But they've reacted to it in the most ridiculous manner. They're basically trying to change collective memory by changing history's building blocks. But they're doing it by physically destroying what represents the past, literally. It's not like anyone gave a fuck about these statues on a strategic level. It wasn't an issue to most of us up until it was streamed online. But by doing this, ISIS tried to short-circuit the whole situation. They come across as if they've by now realized that they are, in fact, a simulation, a radical non-identity which is represented by what it doesn't represent. To remind you, they are time and again refuted by the USA, for instance. They are refuted to only be a clone, a misrepresentation of Islam posing as true Islam. So to push back, they're now inflicting physical violence on ancient relics in order to simulate an actual cognitive change of history, to convince the God of history himself that they are real and so that they could somehow change capitalism, though it's clearly futile. And this is This in a sense feels to me and some of my Facebook buddies as a totally moronic and yet very intellectually acrobatic move at one and the same time. And therefore, it actually feels like a much scarier move. Because by resorting to digital simulation, they, as radicals, prove to be only more distant ambassadors of the capitalist cultural approach, which is doing exactly that. By digitizing history and also simulating it and then virally simulating it on social media, with the very same action, they've officially done away with the possibility of real transcendence. All our glorious culture is now meeting the same fate, a merger of capitalized digital simulation into non-essential, rootless, yet touchable and plasticized commodity which could be smashed into smithereens. And paradoxically, this fusion of body and spirit also makes suddenly the primordial mega simulation of God, in this case their Allah, a much more tangible, viable concept. That's it. So we could turn the lights on. I'll turn the light. Yeah, great. Okay, people actually stayed. Thank you. Do we really want to do this Q&A thing? Does anyone have a question? Does anyone completely, totally disagree? Have I ransacked your entire system of beliefs?
I just have to ask.
Yeah.
I just watched it last night, the new documentary movie. I don't know how new it is. The BBC movie called Bitterly.
Yes, by Adam Curtis.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I saw it last night, and it totally shifted some ways that I think about, or what I knew about things going in Afghanistan, Iraq, or the way the truth is being told, or the narratives and the stories that we were all through the years, those last 20 years, being told through by Israeli or American politicians, like giving a narrative of good and evil and things like that. It does collide a bit. I don't know how to put it into words, but in some way it collides with the way talking about ISIS, about what's the origin of ISIS. The movie actually connects them somehow to Saudi Arabia.
Right.
Not really. I just wanted to.
I mean,
you mentioned the movie.
No, I thought it was a remarkable film. I really like Adam Curtis because he's maybe the only credible conspiracy theorist that I know. I mean, he actually has a point, right? Well, I'm not saying that these cultures don't, or these identities don't claim to have an origin. I'm just wondering how valid it really is and how it is interpreted by the mainstream culture, and how much of a chance they actually have to get away with it eventually. That's I guess.
How do you define valid right now? Like, what do you mean when you say?
Wow.
Yeah. Wow.
Valid in a sense that. Wait, what do you mean? How do I define? What's your argument?
Like,
basically?
what I hear when you say valid is, do you accept its validity, or I don't know, is it real Islam, or like this is what I hear, or this is what I think I hear when you say valid or not valid. You judge the validity of ISIS.
No, I guess valid in the sense that it could actually create some kind of change, that it could actually reshift the paradigm, that it could actually bring us back to another stage of consciousness, I guess, as a society, as a civilization. I mean, there's some really interesting talk lately about accelerationism, there's accelerationist capitalists or accelerationist theorists who are saying basically one of the main problems of both right-wing, if you could consider of ISIS right-wing, I don't know, and also left-wing, is that they're kind of trying to push back always what is actually today this turbo high capitalism, late capitalism, I think, by, you know, trying to bring it back to a previous form, of trying to use a different form of conduct of financial whatever or society, when actually it's rigged. There's no really way to do this, because basically the very form in which society today works, in which market works, in which we all communicate, has changed so comprehensively that there's no way to actually bring these old ghosts of the past back. So what these accelerationists are actually advocating for is this idea of actually, I haven't yet fully read the entire text, it sounds really compelling, kind of like go into even more turbo capitalism to such an extent that it somehow kind of like fixes things. Like not neoliberalism, but something we can't even imagine right now that is so accelerated. And some of them are actually kind of like saying, well, you know, we have a really good, we have really good news for you and really bad news for you. The good news is life is going to carry on even after any amount of apocalypses which we will actually inflict on planet Earth, and that is obviously great, and life forms which we have created will actually be able to go to other planets and create new civilizations. The bad news is that it doesn't include us. So we might actually destroy ourselves, but in the process give way to a multitude of insects which will, you know, inherit the earth and use our culture as some kind of fertilized ground. We might create artificial intelligence, which won't be made out of the same biological construct, which actually needs an entire ecosystem to survive and can't. It's very hard to take this ecosystem to another planet, and through that, you know, through this acceleration, life will go on thanks to us, but it just won't include us because the human race is just gone. So these are two prospects of accelerationism, like pushing forward, kind of like thinking about the coming futile dead end as something which will pass, like on a wider scale. Yeah.
That's very cheerful.
In a way. I mean, it's kind of like, hey, you're doing a good thing. Keep going.